Welcome to our third video of Unit 2, 1607 to 1754. In this video, we're going to look at some of the impacts of conquest and colonization, both on Europe and on the native peoples in the Americas and on enslaved Africans. So we are actually going to cover a number of topics in this video. We're going to be looking at topics 2.4, the transatlantic trade, 2.5, interactions between American Indians and Europeans, and 2.6, slavery in the British colonies. Okay, so let's look at our first question. What were the effects of the transatlantic trade over time? To really understand this, we need to understand mercantilism and the Atlantic economy. So mercantilism was based on the idea that it was a prevailing economic theory in the early modern period, that there was a fixed amount of wealth in the world. There was only so much, so you had to fight for that piece of the pie. So this led European states into a particular goal. That was to increase their supply of gold and silver, to increase the amount of money that they had. Now, that seems pretty obvious to us that wealth is based on gold and silver, but prior to the early modern period, wealth was often based on the amount of land you had and resources you controlled. So how do we reach this goal of increasing our supply of gold and silver? Well, it was a simple concept. Import less, but export more. So increase your exports, limit your imports, as in sell lots of stuff and get money from it, but don't buy a lot of stuff from other people. Now, this was not terribly successful, mainly because Europeans had a really strong demand for luxury goods that were pretty expensive. The role of the colonies in this mercantilist system was that they were intended to really provide the raw materials that were shipped to England and then made into manufactured goods. And then they were the markets for those English goods. That was the role of the economies. The role of the British colonies was really, their economies were all focused on producing goods for the British economy, for the Atlantic economy. So to this end, Britain is going to pass a series of what's called navigation acts or navigation laws between 1650 and 1673. So these essentially were intended to help England reap the benefits of colonies and trade with the colonies. So they set a series of laws that basically required all trade that the colonies engaged in to be carried out in some way through England. And there was a few different ways they did this. First of all, they required all trade that the colonies engaged in to be done on English or colonial ships. They couldn't sell goods to people who were sailing, Spanish ships, for example. All that trade had to go on English or colonial ships. And the goods themselves that went to the colonies had to go through England. England required any country that wanted to sell goods to the colonies had to first ship them to England, sell them to England, and then allow the English merchants to actually take the goods to the colonies and sell them there for, I assume, a marked up price. So there was a middleman there. In addition to that, certain what were called enumerated goods that came from the colonies, like tobacco, for example, that was highly desirable, were only allowed to be sold to England. Now, England could, of course, then take those goods like tobacco and sell them elsewhere, again, for a higher price. But either way, the trade was supposed to flow through England, as though the colonies themselves were physically attached to England, which of course they were not. Now, here's the thing. The enforcement of these navigation acts was extremely lax in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. And there's a few different reasons for this. First of all, the distance just made it really hard to regulate. On top of that, Britain was in a great deal of turmoil from about between 1642 to 1763. Not only did they have a civil war and a revolt that ultimately led to a new reigning monarch, they also had four wars with France. So they were pretty distracted. And then, of course, on top of that, many of the royal colonial agents were actually pretty corrupt. It was pretty easy to bribe them to look the other way if you were smuggling goods in and out that were meant to go through England so they could be taxed. So either way, the navigation acts were enforced pretty laxly. And ultimately, this is going to cause problems later on when the English do attempt to enforce these more tightly in the late 18th century. One other effect of this Atlantic economy on Europe, on Britain in particular, was this consumer revolution. So, trade with the colonies is going to fuel what we would call a consumer revolution of the 17th and 18th century. Essentially, people had more stuff. People had more goods. You can kind of see this from this image here. You can see this was really common at the time, but you can see there's quite a few goods in here. There's fine cloth clothing, a beautiful stained window, tapestries over the furniture. This what appears to be either a gold or pewter mug. There's a box on the table, a decorative box, maps on the wall. So clearly, there's people just had more things, and increasingly the cultural and economic status you had became about what you could afford, not as much about your lineage. So eventually we are going to start to see this growing middle class in Europe, and a lot of this is because of the colonies. Okay, we're going to move on now to talking about some of our information from 2.5. So we're going to look now at how did Native Americans use armed resistance to fight European encroachments on land and indigenous cultures. As colonies grew, it only makes sense that they would begin to push against borders that had been established early on in colonial history between Native populations and Europeans. As more and more came, they needed more and more space, or wanted more and more space. Okay, so we are going to see this kind of recurring story. These interactions with Europeans, the greater interactions that occurred, just continued to foster conflict over land and resources. Now, in British North America, we see this a lot. And here's a couple examples. One of the first ones we can talk about is the Tuscarora War. This was in North Carolina in the 18th century. It occurred between about 1711 and 1715. Now, what actually ended up happening is new settlers came into North Carolina. Increasingly, they wanted to get away from this tidewater area that had a lot of illness and very kind of marshy, swampy land, and they wanted to move further and further inland. And this really did, again, encroach on Indian territory. On top of that, they also did trade in slaves. Many of the settlers did enslave Indians or make raids upon Indian settlements, enslave them, and sell them. Okay, so this Indian slave trade, the encroachment on land, led Indians in 1711 to attack New Bern, which was a settlement that had been built on native land. Now, the Carolinian colonists responded to this by retaliating and killed hundreds of Tuscaroraans, and then hundreds more were sold into slavery. And what ended up happening is the remaining Tuscaroraans were sort of absorbed into the Iroquois Confederacy. Another example of this conflict is going to be in New England, Metacom's War, or sometimes called King Philip's War, and this occurred from 1675 to 1676. So once again, we see the same story of English encroachment on Indian land, conflict after conflict, small armed battles breaking out into larger conflicts. In the 1630s, encroachment on Indian land in New England led to the Pequot War, which virtually annihilated the Pequots. By the 1670s, the sort of the only hope for maintaining Indian autonomy and maintaining their land was under this pan-Indian alliance that was spreading across New England, led by Metacom. So Metacom was called King Philip by the English, which is why it's sometimes called King Philip's War. So Metacom and his men led mounted coordinated assaults on different English villages between 1675 and 1676, and they killed quite a few. Now, ultimately, this war is going to be crushed by the colonists. Metacom himself is killed, and his family was sold into slavery. It did slow down the westward movement of British settlers for decades, but ultimately it was devastating for New England Indians. After this, it really broke their strength. They were no longer more than a sporadic threat to the colonists. We also see similar forms of resistance in Spanish North America. For example, the Pueblo Revolt in 1680. The Spanish conquest of the Southwest in New Mexico was absolutely brutal. In the initial conquest of the city of Acoma in New Mexico, the Spanish killed half of the city's 1,500 inhabitants, and then of the survivors, every male survivor over 15 had 1 foot cut off, and then they enslaved most of the remaining women and children. After that, they went forward. There really wasn't a ton of resources in the Southwest. It is a desert, but they went forward with pushing forced conversion on native peoples there. Now, eventually, this is going to lead to a revolt. In 1680, the Puebloan people revolted, and in a reversal of what had happened 80 years before, they destroyed every Catholic church in the province and they killed hundreds of settlers. Now, it actually did give them autonomy and control over New Mexico for decades. It took nearly 50 years to reconquer all of New Mexico. And afterwards, the Spanish had learned to accommodate some aspects of American Indian culture, rather trying to force it wholesale on American Indians. Okay, so we're going to take the last part of this to really look at slavery in the British colonial regions. This is kind of the focus of topic 2.6. So what were the causes and effects of slavery in various British colonial regions? So one thing you do need to understand is that all of the British colonies participated in and relied on enslaved labor to different degrees. Okay, and we do think of the southern colonies when we think of slave labor, and there's a reason for that because of the plantation economies. New England had very few slaves, but you'll find that as you move further south, you are going to see more slaves. And we already mentioned in the last video, New England didn't have very good soil for plantation economies, so that's why there were pretty few slaves in New England. The middle colonies, there was a few more enslaved peoples on large estates, and some working in port cities, in trades especially, or as sailors or dock workers. In the Chesapeake and the southern colonies, of course, we have these plantation economies development, as we talked about, after the 17th century. As this shift away from indentured servitude, we are going to see the use of enslaved people. And of course, in the British West Indies, pretty much the vast majority of people were slaves, enslaved peoples. Okay, so in terms of how slavery changed in the British colonies, we really already talked about this. In 1619, the first African laborers who were brought were actually indentured servants. Early Africans brought over, many of them were just given terms of indenture, like white indentured servants. And then after a certain amount of years, they were set free, and many of them became farmers themselves or took up in trades. But by the late 17th century, as we've mentioned, we're seeing this increasing volume of slavery. And this is where we really see, as we turn to slavery as the primary form of labor in these especially southern colonies, this is when we see the development of chattel slavery, in which slaves were literally treated as goods, as cattle, not as people. Okay, so we're going to see the development of them as defined as goods and property, not in any way people, and the development of slave laws as well. This chattel slavery, as we said, defined African laborers as chattel, as goods, and it also made the condition of slavery inheritable through the mother, as in if your mother was a slave, the child was born a slave. These slave codes become increasingly harsh as time goes on, and especially after Bacon's Rebellion, we see this growing dividing line between Black and white laborers, whereas white labor is defined as free or as not enslaved labor, and Black labor is increasingly defined as slave labor. We're also going to start to see the interracial marriages are going to be forbidden. Other regional developments, England was really seeking to emulate the Spanish model in the British West Indies. As we've already kind of discussed in the previous video, there was a large-scale slave-based extractive agriculture. They introduced slave codes, and those are going to become the basis for slave codes in the southern colonies by the late 1600s. It is worthwhile noting that northern colonies also participated in slavery, though they did not have a great deal of slaves. They did profit from procuring slaves, transporting them, and distributing African people as commodities. So it was less a matter of moral conflict for many people in the northern colonies, but more a matter of simply their agriculture did not support plantation economies, so they did not own many slaves. But that did not mean they did not ever participate in slavery. So slavery becomes increasingly institutionalized across the 18th century. Colonial laws like slave codes were intended to otherize people of color, make them other from non-slaves. So laws became increasingly more restrictive. Interracial marriage was forbidden, as I mentioned. Increasingly, African free Blacks were denied property rights. They were denied ownership or carrying of weapons. They were often had their movement restricted. They were denied the freedom to assemble. And then whites, particularly in areas that depended very heavily on enslaved labor forces, they were given legal sanction to beat, torture, and kill Africans that were considered their property because they were enslaved. So, how did enslaved people respond to slavery? So, certainly there was a great deal of slave resistance. It is not as though the Africans who were enslaved simply accepted their conditions. So, there were a couple different kinds of slave resistance, both covert and overt. The more covert types of resistance, including maintaining customs and belief systems and languages and naming practices from Africa. And they also slowed down work by breaking tools or damaging crops. And of course, there were occasionally overt outbreaks of physical altercations, of rebellions, and running away. The Stono Rebellion in 1739 is a really good example of somewhere between 40 and 60 enslaved peoples marching through. And basically, they were trying to escape to Spanish Florida. They killed about 20 white people, they spared others, and the rebellion was ultimately ended by the white colonists. This really began to challenge the narrative of slavery as this benevolent institution, because if it was benevolent, why would people be rebelling or trying to run away in the first place? It is also going to have some pretty negative consequences. Sort of the unintended consequences of the Stono Rebellions and others like it was that it did introduce the overseer on plantations to enforce labor discipline. And additionally, plantation holders tried to use selective messages of Christianity, preaching to slaves that it was slave labor was for a heavenly reward. If you worked in this life, then you'd be rewarded in heaven. This actually mostly didn't work, as enslaved peoples actually more unsurprisingly found a lot more in common with the biblical struggles of the oppressed. So they found these stories much more appealing. So enslaved peoples also engaged in a process of preserving, as I already said, their languages and customs as much as they could, and they often blended them into new environments. So slave revolts were pretty rare overall because there was limited access to weapons. It was very difficult to coordinate actions on a large scale. Plantations were far between. It was very hard to plan in secrecy because of limits on assembly. And they were extremely high risk. The white responses to rebellion were extreme and very, very dangerous. So there were more indirect challenges to the racial order. And again, maintaining religion, culture, and custom became a way to subvert order. Education and literacy also became a subversive act. Learning how to read and write in private became this very subversive act. Okay, so that's it for us for this video for 2.4, 2.5, and 2.6. We have one more video left in our series for Unit 2.